Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. 23 years before the Battle of Yavin, decades of tension between a group of secessionists in the Outer Rim systems and the Galactic Republic reached new heights. Entire sectors and systems were breaking away from the core world-controlled Republic and joining the newly established Confederacy of Independent Systems. When news that Confederacy head of state Count Dooku had raised a massive separatist droid army, panic spread through Coruscant, leading to the expedited passage of the Military Creation Act. This act would reinstate a federal military for the first time in 1,000 years for the Republic. It would grant Supreme Chancellor Palpatine with emergency powers that would mark the beginning of the end for the Republic. Chancellor Palpatine would address the Senate shortly after the passing of this act. He'd say the following:
I love democracy.
I think Palpatine is being honest about his affection for his own government system. He understands the intricacies of how to broker power in a democracy and achieve his goals better than anyone, which is why his political career has always been worth following very closely. Today we'll be taking a look at Palpatine's impact on the galaxy and what it can teach us about a democracy. Some people attribute all of the suffering caused by the Clone Wars and Separatist Crisis to solely the Sith. It was Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious who pulled the puppet strings from behind the curtains and orchestrated unrest and political turmoil that led to the Clone Wars. But I would argue that the two Sith had a relatively easy time at sowing chaos because a lot of these problems already existed and weren't really their faults. After the Golden Age of the Republic and High Republic period, efforts to bring the Republic's presence to the Outer Rim stalled. The Outer Rim was a place full of potential. There were millions of new planets to settle on and tons of resources to gather from each one of these planets. But the lack of hyperspace lanes and security forces in the region kinda made it too risky for the average person to settle there. Supreme Chancellor Lina So, more than 200 years earlier, had pushed for the unification of the entire galaxy. She increased exploration and infrastructure projects in the Outer Rim. She also had several great works planned, including the Starlight Beacon. The Starlight Beacon was a massive space station that would serve as a communication relay hub that would increase the speed of messages coming from the core worlds. It also had a permanent Jedi Force and Republic Defense Coalition fleet stationed on it. Such projects were a massive investment in resources and manpower. It also showed inhabitants in the Outer Rim that they weren't alone, and it created a sense of togetherness in the Republic that was not replicated in later periods. But 100 years later, the federal government began abandoning Outer Rim projects and investment. We're not 100% sure why this happened, but it most likely had to do with budgeting. Projects like the Starlight Beacon were driven by ideology and this idea that the Republic is all-encompassing of the entire galaxy. But it was far too expensive to maintain and didn't justify its own presence thanks to how sparsely populated these areas were. The truth was, you couldn't bring in enough tax revenue from the Outer Rim to justify something like the Starlight Beacon. And so by 124 BBY, the Galactic Senate labeled the entire Outer Rim as a free trade zone. The idea was to stop investing public money into the area and try to attract private money and capital. This attracted several large corporations like the Techno Union and the Trade Federation to set up entire manufacturing supply chains in the area. They would mine raw resources there and process them, and then turn them into finished goods and then ship them to the core at very competitive prices. But with the corporations also came greed and exploitation. On worlds where corporations landed, local businesses were usually destroyed, and then the locals usually were completely helpless and quickly exploited as slave labor or indentured servants. The Republic basically abandoned the Outer Rim and allowed corporations to take over their positions and rule over the people there. And this is what really started creating a lot of tension between Outer Rim colonists and these corporations. It was in these conditions that a rough character named Iako Stark would become popular amongst the population. He was a smuggler and criminal, but was also viewed as a Robin Hood-like character. He would attack Trade Federation shipping lines and then redistribute some of the items he seized from those shipments. Stark would later on cause the Stark Hyperspace War. Although government programs oftentimes are poorly run, go over budget, and generally are less efficient than their private sector counterparts, abandoning entire regions of the galaxy to private corporations in the guise of saving money is not a good idea and leads to long-term ramifications. The Outer Rim is where the Separatist crisis began, but the policies that led to this civil war started out in the Republic's Senate. Now, if we take a look at America's urban centers, under-policing and a lack of high-quality policing in residential neighborhoods have led to huge disparities in quality of life. The absence of safety and security leads to less services and retail infrastructure, which leads to lower home prices and economic stability, which itself leads to less tax revenue, which leads to less money for essential services like education and security, which of course creates a death spiral situation for a neighborhood. Ideas like defunding the police, ironically, are reminiscent of post-Civil War policies created by Southern legislatures to devastate segregated Black communities. Although in these cases it wasn't just a lack of security that was threatened, schools, public libraries, and parks were also defunded to take resources from Black Americans. In general, simple solutions like the free trade zone or defunding the police are an example of lazy policy making that isn't really clearly thought out, that can lead ultimately to really bad outcomes. The Outer Rim Free Trade Zone and defund the police are both politically motivated policies that lack nuance and actual thought behind them. When these type of policies emerge, it's usually the sign of some kind of shady populace who wants the adoration of the voters for very little work in return. And a government that neglects its people but continues collecting taxes is one that will lose its mandate to rule. When the Clone Wars started, it was a really traumatic experience that affected the entire galaxy. During the High Republic era, massive efforts were made by the federal government to create a galactic-wide identity united behind the Republic. Patriotism and love for the Republic were at an all-time high, pushed forward by visible policy and infrastructure plans dedicated to the Outer Rim. To see that all fall apart and go to waste just a few centuries later was heartbreaking for many, especially those in the core worlds who truly still believed in the Republic. To them, Palpatine was Abraham Lincoln. Here was a man who graciously and hesitantly accepted executive powers that he needed in order to preserve the Republic, from collapse and failure. These were powers that he would lay down once the war was over and the galaxy was safe from fracture. Now, some other individuals would have viewed Palpatine a lot less favorably. They might have compared him to Hitler or something like that. Palpatine rearmed the Republic. He created a massive military power structure, and he continued to increase executive power and control all throughout the Clone Wars. They'll say that once the war is over, Palpatine will continue stepping on the Galactic Constitution because his only true goal is to seize complete power. Now, while this second group is ultimately going to be more correct than the first group, both points of view have merit. There rarely is one truth in the political world. There are, however, preferences and biases that shape our view of things. There are no individuals out there, however, that are 100% evil, and there are no individuals who are 100% good. To frame things in that manner is not only dishonest, but can create roadblocks for actual positive change.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Which actually is an absolute statement in itself. That's your typical Jedi shenanigans in play here. The point is, Palpatine can be an evil dictator, Sith Lord who destroys planets with giant space lasers, but at the same time, he kept the Republic together and strengthened the federal government and military-industrial complex, which created billions and trillions of jobs. His policies created a lot of suffering, but it also improved the lives of many. This is unfortunately very reflective of how things work in real life. And we should have the intellectual honesty and bravery to set aside our emotions and prejudices and act as objective observers and adults. And that's because a democracy is only as strong as the individuals partaking into them. If we let emotions and prejudices guide our every decision rather than objectivity and rationale, then the individuals in government will reflect that. Most people didn't see Palpatine as the evil individual he was until much later on in the war. In the beginning of his career in the halls of the Senate, he wasn't known as a fiery orator or a strongman type politician. He was an elusive character who had friends all across the political spectrum. He was a deal maker, and he purposely stayed out of the limelight while quietly collecting political favors and allies. And most importantly, Palpatine was known as an extremely competent individual. He just got things done. A capable politician like Palpatine knows that the limelight is always on him, and so every move he makes, every word he speaks, must be very calculated. The sheer amount of discipline that Palpatine had to have to create this type of image was impressive. So it's no surprise that Palpatine also understood the main service that governments provide to their people. It is the government's job to make sure that every citizen feels nice and safe at home when they go to sleep at night. If a government cannot do that, then they also lose their mandate to rule. And so fear was a very powerful tool in Palpatine's arsenal. It was ultimately fear of the Separatist droid army that created the Republic military. It was fear of the Separatist advance on the core worlds that led to the expansion of the Grand Army of the Republic. It was that same fear of the Separatists that led to Palpatine's nationalization of the intergalactic banking claims.
May our people be free and safe. Long live the banks!
The reality is, the average individual is far too busy with work and family and other things to really have a good understanding of how geopolitics will affect their individual safety. The average person is supposed to be able to trust institutions such as the media or the federal government because these institutions have carefully built up their own expertise and public trust throughout the years. It's supposedly their jobs to convince the populace that certain policies need to be put into place to guarantee all of our safety. Now, Palpatine would misuse this authority and trust to carefully erode the freedoms of the average citizen throughout the Clone Wars. An undereducated and underinformed populace can quickly dismantle the institutions of democracy. Now, freedom and democracy are completely different things. We just commonly associate these terms together because democracies are usually seen as the freest type of government. But in a democracy, freedoms can still be taken away, even by the electors themselves. At the same time, a policy that creates more freedom can result to less freedom in others. For instance, if you create a free trade zone in the Outer Rim, it creates more economic opportunities, but ultimately much less freedom for the local inhabitants, who have now become indentured servants in factories. Now, I really love political shenanigans, so I also really like Palpatine. I mean, it's amazing some of the things he was able to pull off in his career, and also very terrifying. To see our representative democracy like the Republic collapse and turn into the Empire in only a few years makes me really worry about stuff sometimes. But also, Star Wars is a great introduction into politics for novices and experienced people alike because they do discuss a lot of interesting things that seem to parallel our own world here, especially if you read deeper into the lore and look at novels like Plagueis or watch the Clone Wars TV cartoon series. Generally I think that's what makes Star Wars and the prequel era specifically so interesting. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie and you are the protagonist.